to Washington in Focus. I'm Washington State government reporter for the Center Square, Carlene Johnson, and I'm joined by our Washington investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, who wrote about the Attorney General Office's Domestic Extremism and Mass Violence Task Force. That's a long, I don't know what the acronym is on that, TJ. That's a mouthful. They're out with their initial report on how to treat issues from a public health perspective. And we're specifically going to be discussing what you wrote extensively about in the article, domestic violent extremism. We hear a lot about that. It harkens back to the Capitol insurrection and some other things that have, I guess, some would categorize as domestic violent extremism, but others won't. So what did the task force, what was the main takeaway in this initial report? And then some of the things that you dug into a little deeper, TJ.
Well, I think the thing that has always struck me as odd is people representing organizations that engage in political activism getting to define what extremism is. And with regards to, we're not talking about violent. So there's a couple things rhetorically. I can see how people would have a problem with the term domestic violent extremism to describe peaceful, protected speech. And that's what's going on here potentially. And this is why they're struggling to define it, is, in my opinion, is because there are, I would say, significant constitutional issues with defining protected lawful speech and political activism as domestic violent extremism and classifying it as a separate form of speech compared to other free speech. And it's based on what a group of people who themselves engage in political activism get to decide.
Well, who are the people on this, task force that your article pointed out? Some of them seem to have a pretty clear agenda, on the outset. So tell me who some of these folks are.
Well, focus on the family is not among them. I can tell you that. What you do see is, for example, Utopia Washington is one of the groups. It's a queer and trans people of color led organization. You have the Washington Immigrant Defense Network, which provides funding and support services for lawyers who represent low income detained immigrants. You have the Western State Center, which has opposed President Trump's executive orders regarding the mass migration that has occurred illegally in the country. They've called it a false and bigoted statement to describe it as an invasion. And then there's the Peace and Justice Action League, which among its priorities for last year was ending mass incarceration and systemic racism in our city, county carceral system, and countering white nationalism. So I think the thing that you see here, what you didn't see here, is an organization that's calling for a restriction on immigration or immigration moratorium. You don't see organizations that are calling for parental rights and advocating for more parental rights in the education system. You didn't see any homeschool groups. So it's just interesting that it's like, who gets to decide what extremism is? And this is one of the things that's in the report, is they really don't know what to do, because the problem is that the FBI has their own definition, but it describes illegal activity for the most part. I think that it blurs the line a little bit. And then they have the ADL, which has its own definition. The ADL is a private organization. They can classify people however they want because they're not in control of anything. This is a taxpayer-funded group that is, in a way, taking money from certain people in Washington State and using that money to label their protected speech as extremism.
Now,
by people who they could argue, one could argue that these organizations are all a bunch of domestic extremism groups themselves. It's all a question of, and I think the other issue is that extremism is based on what would you call it? It's a question of what's considered normal. I mean, go back 100 years and see what extremism would have looked like. Like, how many of these groups would have been considered domestic extremism if we were having this discussion 100 years ago?
Now, they cited some historical examples in Washington. I mean, I'm just thinking of most recent history, right? And some of the stuff that happened at the University of Washington, the pro Hamas groups last summer, and then again this year. We've had some, we had $1 million or more in damage to the engineering building. I'm thinking of an incident like that. I'm thinking of, and you wrote about this in your article, what happened during the Summer of Love, Jazz and Chop. I mean, was that in the report? Is that cited as an example of extremism?
No, and the thing about all those examples you just cited is they were all incidents that were violent and they were illegal and criminal in nature.
Yeah.
In contrast, they cited as a form of domestic extremism the off-duty Seattle Police Department officers who attended the Stop the Steal rally. And then they try to tie that into what they describe as an insurrection, despite the fact that no one has been charged with insurrection. And then they called it a deadly one. The only person killed at that incident that was, or I guess you could call it a riot or a violent protest, was Ashley Babbitt, who was one of the protesters, and her family just settled a $6 million lawsuit with the federal government over her death. So they're trying to tie in the fact that these officers were at a rally, a legal political gathering, with what they describe as an insurrection, despite the fact that they were not charged with a crime. They did lose their jobs for, I think, being on a premise that they were not authorized to be in. But this idea the idea that people cannot attend certain political rallies where no crime has been committed, no acts of violence have been done, because the Stop the Steal rally is not the same as what happened at the actual Capitol or inside of it. You could have attended the rally and not gone inside the Capitol, and that's what most people did. There was at least 1 million people there. So, and only a small percentage of that actually obviously could have even fit in the Capitol. So this is the issue that's going on. And I think it's going to continue to handicap their efforts to treat this from a public health perspective, is that if you label certain individuals or certain groups to be domestic violent extremists, I can see a lawsuit coming from that, because it implies that the government is going to discriminate against you, or it could cause, and then there's numerous Supreme Court cases on this. For anybody who's been trained as a reporter or journalist knows that anything that caught by the government that causes a chilling of speech, that can be proven in court, that causes people to not engage in a political activity or to speak out of fear of government retribution because of a government policy, like you could see with this. I mean, who wants to apply for a permit for a rally from the government when a task force has labeled them domestic violent extremists?
Well, and I wonder if they looked at all at the stuff that you and I have been talking about in the past few podcasts. I think we've at least covered it twice. The faith-based groups that held the rally in Seattle, right? And then they were literally attacked, had water bottles full of urine and other hard objects thrown at them, hurled at them, and police were injured. And then there was the subsequent larger rally in front of City Hall downtown by the same faith-based groups who are pushing back on the taking away of parental rights in Washington. But then, I was there. We talked about that those groups that were there literally throwing things, pushing people down, physically, not allowing folks to enter into the event. You want to talk about the chilling of free speech? I mean,
this is why I think this task force is going to have problems getting off the ground in terms of how it implements these policies. Because one, how do you treat it? How do you treat protected speech and protected political activity as if it's a public health issue? I mean,
it's a good question in itself, but
and the use of taxpayer dollars to try to convince people to not say or think things that they don't approve of. It almost goes back to the saying that 1984, the novel, was a warning, not an instruction manual. And so,
well, what are they doing with this information? So this is their preliminary report, and they have to report back to lawmakers, majority Democrats, who will use this to promote whatever agenda they want, or what's the goal?
I mean, that's the issues. They have to come up with a working definition, and they got to have the report done by end of next year. This is going to be the big issues. They want to classify protected legal political activity and political speech as a in a category where it is something that needs to be done away with and treated as if it's a sickness, right? It's almost like you're treating it as a political disease is effectively what they're going to label legal activity, legal speech, legal political activism as a public health disease.
Unless, of course, it seems you are aligned with what many of the members of the task force believe? Because in reading the ones that you wrote about in your article, TJ, it looked like all would be either slightly to completely left of center. And not only that, but very agenda driven. And so if those are the folks that are to report back, supposedly with an objective definition for lawmakers, I don't know that we're going to have much neutrality.
Yeah, what you're going to see is you're going to see a certain ideological bent and a certain ideological viewpoint being labeled the mainstream correct view.
Right.
And anything that deviates from that and anything that's a threat to that is going to be treated like extremism. And they're going to use, they could potentially be using taxpayer dollars to go after. And when I say go after, I mean where they try to undermine. I'm not saying they're going to like arrest people or anything like that because they don't have the authority to do that. But where they make recommendations to the legislature on, hey, when, like, for example, are they going to use the education system? And some kids start saying something in class or, you know, as opposed to say mass migration, or they believe that our immigration, the number of immigrants we allow into the country legally should be reduced. They could be taken aside and basically treated like they have a disease. And that raises dangerous. Yeah, again, they use a lot of these really weird words in the report that people can read because it's linked to in the story. But it really begs the question of, practically speaking, what does this look like? Like what does this policies put into action? What does treating certain ideologies and beliefs as a public health issue look like? Because you're effectively saying we need to treat it like it's the smallpox or COVID or it's whatever disease that's going on.
Why is it a public health issue to begin with, right?
Well, I know. Why does the government, it goes back to the whole point of the First Amendment is that government doesn't get to decide. Like the only thing that matters, the only difference between certain types of speech is whether it's speech that is free speech and speech where it falls outside of that based on what the Supreme Court has ruled is not protected speech. And there are examples of that. You cannot say, I'm going to kill someone, or call for the killing of someone, or say this person needs to be, eliminated. You can't obviously do that, but you can but trying to classify different types of speech that fall within the realm of free speech by a government entity is constitutionally problematic.
Well, I'm so glad that you're writing about this because I have not seen much coverage of this at all. And I think that they're, like you say, what's really the goal here, and what will lawmakers do with this or not, when the deadline comes for the task force report. So thank you, TJ. I really appreciate your reporting on this. For more information, you can go to thecentersquare.com/Washington to find TJ's story. For now, I'm Carlene Johnson along with TJ Martinell. This has been Washington in Focus.